July 1942. 25 U.S. airmen aboard 8 warplanes prepare to embark on one of the most dangerous aviation missions ever conducted, part of Operation Bolero, a daring bid to fly aircraft across the North Atlantic's perilous Snowball Route to join the war in Europe. Estimates suggest 10% of Bolero aircraft won't make it. But as the mission gets underway, the reality quickly becomes far worse than anybody could have predicted. Somewhere in the frozen skies between Greenland and Iceland, the entire squadron goes missing. On base, commanders demand answers. Had they been caught in a snowstorm, shot down by the Germans? But there had been no distress calls, and search parties came back empty-handed. No wreckage, no oil slicks, no bodies. Somehow, the unit had vanished into thin air. Operation Bolero. In spring 1942, the United States was ramping up its military production to levels never before seen in human history. American factories were churning out hundreds of aircraft daily. Fighters, bombers, and transport planes, all desperately needed to turn the tide against Nazi Germany. Getting these aircraft to the European theater presented a critical challenge. Shipping them by sea was the obvious solution, but German U-boats were wreaking havoc in the Atlantic, sending countless Allied vessels to the ocean floor. The alternative was to fly them across, but the fighters of that era lacked the range to make such a journey without stopping to refuel. Eventually, U.S. military planners found a solution. As part of Operation Bolero, aircraft would be flown in stages across the North Atlantic. The route, nicknamed the Snowball Route, would take them from Maine to Labrador, then on to Greenland, Iceland, and finally to their destination in the United Kingdom. At each stop, the aircraft would refuel before continuing their journey. The first Operation Bolero mission, led by Colonel Paul Tibbets, who would later gain fame as the pilot of the Enola Gay, the B-29 that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, successfully completed the journey to England. This proved the concept was viable, despite the challenging conditions of the northern route. On July 7, 1942, the second mission of Operation Bolero began. 2 formations, codenamed Tomcat Yellow and Tomcat Green, each consisting of 4 Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighters and 1 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bomber, departed from Presque Isle, Maine. The initial legs went according to plan. The Lightnings and their bomber escorts reached Goose Bay, Labrador without incident. After refueling, they headed toward their next destination, Bluey West 1, a remote airbase in Greenland nestled at the end of a long mountain-ringed fjord. By early morning on July 15, 1942, both Tomcat squadrons were airborne again after their stopover in Greenland, heading southeast toward Iceland. Their route would take them over the vast Greenland ice cap, across the Denmark Strait, and on to Reykjavik. From there, it would be a relatively short hop to Scotland and their final destination. Troubles begin. As the 8 P-38s and 2 B-17s soared across the ice cap at 12,000 feet, the pilots encountered their first challenge, a heavy blanket of clouds forming beneath them. To stay above the weather, they climbed to 14,000 feet, where the temperature plummeted to minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside his P-38, Lieutenant Robert B. Wilson was already struggling with the bitter cold. In a desperate attempt to keep his hands functioning, he tore the defroster from its mounting and used it to warm his gloves enough to feel the controls. Lieutenant Brad McManus recalled that his feet were so cold he could barely feel the rudder pedals. To combat the freezing temperatures, he tried to visualize his parents sitting in bathing suits on a warm beach. 90 minutes from Iceland, their situation deteriorated rapidly. The squadron hit a mass of thick cumulus clouds that forced them to climb another 2,000 feet. Lieutenant Dallas Spider Webb, leading Tomcat Green, radioed that he was taking his formation down to look for clearer conditions beneath the overcast. As they descended, the cloud cover became extremely dense, with later accounts from the pilots describing it as, quote, cotton drenched in tar. Ice began forming on the wings of the P-38s, threatening to disrupt the aerodynamics and potentially bring them down. With the fighters struggling to maintain contact with their B-17 escorts, Wilson ordered the bomber to climb back out of the worsening conditions. At 16,000 feet, Tomcat Green broke through the clouds and rejoined Tomcat Yellow, but their troubles were far from over. The pilots now faced a difficult choice: continue flying through high-altitude, sub-zero temperatures that were turning their extremities numb, or descend back into the stormy soup below. Adding to their predicament, another massive weather front loomed ahead of them. After flying south for 15 minutes, trying to find a way around, Lieutenant Joe Hanna, pilot of one of the B-17s, reported dire news. His radio operator was unable to contact either Reykjavik or a weather plane that was supposed to be flying an hour ahead of them. At 7:15 a.m., the squadron commanders made the difficult decision to turn back. Their plan was to return to their previous refueling stop, the airbase designated as BW-8 on the western side of Greenland. An hour later, they spotted the east coast of Greenland, only to find that the weather there was as bad or worse than what they had already encountered. About 130 miles from their destination, the B-17s received what appeared to be a message from BW-8, reporting, quote, "Ceiling 1,200 feet, visibility 1/8 mile." These dangerous conditions would make landing at the fjord-nestled airbase nearly impossible. Several P-38 pilots, including McManus, decided to drop down to examine the ice cap in case they needed to make an emergency landing. After rejoining the formation between cloud layers, they received what seemed to be good news. BW-1, another airbase at Greenland's southern tip, had reported its runway was open. The pilots set course for this new destination with an estimated arrival time of noon. What they couldn't know was that the weather reports had been switched. The conditions reported for BW-8 were actually those at BW-1, and vice versa. Whether this was due to simple error, or, as some later speculated, Nazi radio interference from a U-boat or secret station, remains uncertain. Landing. After 90 minutes of flying through dense cloud cover, the coastal mountain suddenly appeared through an opening. The pilots realized with growing alarm that they were not approaching their destination on Greenland's west coast. They had somehow returned to the east coast, now 2 hours away from BW-1. Worse yet, McManus's fuel would only last another 20 minutes. With fuel gauges approaching empty and no viable airfields within reach, the squadron faced the grim reality of landing on Greenland's vast ice cap. McManus, now critically low on fuel, volunteered to go in first. He now had to make a critical decision: land with wheels up or down. Hoping they might be able to take off again if more fuel was dropped to them, McManus opted to land with his gear extended. Things went well for the first couple hundred yards as his P-38 touched down on the seemingly smooth ice. Then disaster struck. The front landing gear buckled and crashed through the surface. The momentum immediately flipped the aircraft onto its back, pinning the cockpit against the snow. Smoke began filling the inverted cockpit as McManus struggled to free himself. Though his fuel tanks were nearly empty, reducing the fire risk, he wasn't taking any chances. In a frantic effort, he managed to cut through his parachute harness and release his safety belt. Then he kicked and dug his way out from under the wrecked fighter onto the ice. From above, Lieutenant Wilson observed the crash landing and made a split-second decision. He retracted his own landing gear and prepared for a belly landing instead. His P-38 slid to a smooth stop on the ice, about half a mile from McManus's overturned aircraft. Wilson then raced across the ice to check on his squadron mate. When he reached the overturned Lightning, McManus emerged from under the wing with remarkable composure, calling up to Wilson, quote, "Well, egghead, didn't think I'd make it, did you?" Together, they turned and waved to their comrades circling above, who responded with slow rolls and other acrobatic maneuvers, a pilot's salute to their grounded comrades. One by one, the remaining P-38 pilots brought their fighters down on the ice in wheels-up belly landings. The B-17 bombers remained aloft for another half hour, circling the landing site to expend their remaining fuel and reduce the risk of fire upon landing. Finally, they too settled onto the ice cap, completing the largest forced landing in Air Force history. Lieutenant Harry Smith, the last P-36 pilot to land, approached with characteristic methodical precision. He throttled back at 200 feet, cut off the fuel, carefully feathered both propellers to prevent damage, and slid to a stop with his landing gear retracted. Before leaving his aircraft, he logged the details of the flight and landing in his journal. In a gesture that would prove remarkably prescient, he removed the keys to the P-38's canopy and tossed them inside the cockpit. Survival. As the reality of their situation sank in, the 25 airmen gathered to assess their predicament. They now found themselves stranded on a desolate, featureless ice field in one of the most inhospitable regions on Earth. The temperatures hovered just above freezing during the brief Arctic summer, but they knew it would plummet when night fell. Their only shelter consisted of the aircraft they had just been forced to abandon. The B-17 navigators confirmed their position on the southeastern coast of Greenland, approximately 10 miles inland from the ocean and about 2,000 feet above sea level. With this information, they could at least provide accurate coordinates for a potential rescue mission, if they could establish radio contact with their base. Now, the men faced their first challenge: survival in one of the world's most unforgiving environments. Their training kicked in immediately, as they gathered essential supplies from the aircraft and organized themselves into a functioning unit, despite their extreme circumstances. The crew inventoried their resources and found they were better equipped than might have been expected. They had emergency rations, which they carefully divided to last up to 2 weeks. The B-17 bombers provided relatively comfortable shelter compared to the cramped fighters. Most importantly, they had functioning radios in the bombers that gave them a chance to contact the outside world. Experience with Arctic conditions prompted quick precautions. Warnings were issued not to eat excessive amounts of snow to prevent sore throats, and everyone was instructed to wear sunglasses at all times to avoid the debilitating effects of snow blindness in the endless white landscape. The stranded airmen demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. They fashioned space heaters from empty oxygen bottles by cutting holes in both ends with hacksaws and linking them to engine manifold pipes. Oil drained from the aircraft engines was used as fuel, wicked through these makeshift heaters by parachute straps. These improvised devices provided crucial warmth during the frigid nights on the ice cap. Rescue. Finally, after 3 days of uncertainty, their spirits lifted when a Morse code message came through, confirming that their condition and position had been received. Later that day, 2 C-47 transport planes appeared overhead, dropping supplies by parachute. The relief mission nearly ended in disappointment, and strong winds carried many of the parachutes out of reach, but the stranded men fanned out across the ice and managed to smother several chutes before the wind could claim them. With supplies secured, the waiting game began. The men passed the time listening to music and news picked up on radio signals from Iceland and England. To combat boredom, they organized an impromptu square dance on the wing of one of the B-17s. Another favorite pastime was riding the wind using parachutes to pull them along while sitting on burlap sacks, perhaps the world's first ice cap paragliding. Meanwhile, a complex rescue operation was taking shape. A 30-foot wooden launch, the Uma Tauva, was dispatched from Base BE-2 to the coast nearest the downed aircraft. Among those on board was Donald Kent, son of famed American painter Rockwell Kent, serving as an Arctic advisor to the rescue team. From the coast, the ski and dog sled team was guided through 17 miles of treacherous crevasses by aircraft flying overhead, eventually reaching the stranded airmen 9 days after the emergency landing. At the crash site, the P-38 pilots returned to their aircraft one last time to retrieve personal effects. Some, like Harry Smith, fired .45 caliber slugs into sensitive electronic equipment to prevent it from falling into enemy hands, as there were concerns about Nazi scavenger teams potentially reaching the site. Brad McManus removed the clock from his instrument panel as a keepsake. With the necessary gear packed and ready, the rescue team prepared the men for what would prove to be an exhausting journey out. The 25 airmen struggled through knee-deep snow and ice for hours before reaching the edge of a cliff overlooking the ocean. After descending to the beach, most of the exhausted men found spots to curl up and get some well-deserved rest. Several hours later, the Coast Guard cutter Northland arrived to complete the rescue. After boarding, the weary airmen were treated to hot showers, dry clothes, and what seemed like an extravagant meal after their ordeal on the ice. They were returned to Base BW-1, where they were debriefed, before eventually being sent back to the United States for new assignments. The Lost Squadron. With World War II still raging on, retrieving a single squadron of aircraft abandoned on a remote Greenland glacier was not a priority for the Allies. The time, cost, and effort involved in picking them up would have been considerable and better invested elsewhere. The 8 aircraft abandoned on a remote Greenland glacier quickly faded from memory. The conflict ended, the decades passed by, and the warbirds seemed forgotten by almost everyone except the men who flew them. However, in the late 1970s, an airline pilot named Roy Deegan met Carl Rudder, one of the original Operation Bolero pilots, who told him about the existence of the aircraft. The tale captured Deegan's imagination. He managed to secure salvage rights to the aircraft and approached Atlanta businessman Pat Epps about using his aviation facility to restore them, if they could be recovered. At first, Epps politely declined, having little interest in warplanes at the time. But the seed had been planted, and when Epps later met a wealthy aviator looking to buy a P-38, the idea suddenly seemed worth investigating. In 1981, Pat Epps and his friend Richard Taylor, an architect and fellow pilot with an adventurous streak, decided to make a trip to the Greenland ice cap. They formed the Greenland Expedition Society with a seemingly simple goal: find and recover the aircraft of the so-called Lost Squadron, which they assumed would be just beneath the surface. Taylor later remembered, quote, "Our thoughts were that the tails would be sticking out of the snow. We'd sweep snow off the wings and shovel them out a little bit, crank the planes up, and fly them home." Of course, it didn't happen. Instead, the aircraft were nowhere to be seen. Assessing the situation, Epps concluded, quote, "The tail wasn't sticking out, so they were 10 feet under." The search continues. Despite their initial disappointment, the Greenland Expedition Society remained determined to find the Lost Squadron. They secured exclusive salvage rights from the Danish government, which controlled Greenland, a crucial step, as Roy Deagon's original rights had expired. Year after year, the team returned to the desolate ice cap, each time with improved equipment and renewed enthusiasm. The second expedition found nothing. Neither did their third or fourth. The seemingly simple recovery project had become an obsession, consuming vast amounts of time, energy, and money. By 1988, after multiple failed attempts, the Greenland Expedition Society had spent nearly $1 million and still had nothing to show for it. For their next attempt, the team arrived armed with sophisticated subsurface radar systems and trained operators. Within days, the radar teams pinpointed the exact locations of what appeared to be all 8 aircraft. They were surprised to find they were now approximately 2 miles from their original landing site, having been carried by the moving glacier as it flowed gradually toward the coast. Yet even more shockingly, the aircraft now lay buried beneath not 10 feet, but 264 feet of solid ice, the result of the compression of over 4 decades of heavy Arctic snowfall. To verify their findings, the team used a high-pressure steam probe to melt a narrow hole down to where the radar indicated one of the aircraft should be. When the probe reached the expected depth, it made contact with something solid, confirming that at least one of the Lost Squadron's planes was indeed entombed in the ice. News of this discovery reached Kentucky businessman Roy Schaffner, who'd long been fascinated by the engineering challenge of recovering an airplane from beneath so much ice. A former Air Force fighter pilot and successful manufacturer, Schaffner had the resources to back up his interest. In 1992, he agreed to sponsor an expedition to the ice cap, investing $350,000 to make one final attempt at recovery. Glacier Girl. The expedition, led by Bob Carden, a former helicopter pilot who had joined Epps' team, set out exactly 50 years after the original emergency landing. Their target was Lieutenant Harry Smith's P-38, which historical photographs showed had survived with its propellers both intact and feathered, suggesting it might be in better condition than the others. The extraction method was ingenious. First, the team used a steam probe to locate the aircraft precisely. They then ran a 264-foot steel pipe down to it, which would serve as a guide for the next phase. Above this pipe, they erected an I-beam truss to support their most critical piece of equipment, known as the Super Gopher. Designed by expedition member Bobby Bailey, the Super Gopher was a cone-shaped heater wrapped with copper tubing through which hot liquid circulated. Lowered by an electric winch at a rate of 2 to 4 feet per hour, it melted a shaft 4 feet in diameter through the ice. A bilge pump continuously removed the meltwater as it accumulated. Richard Taylor described the surreal experience of descending into the narrow ice shaft, quote, "I thought about that for a year. Sort of mental preparation. I'd be in an office building in downtown Atlanta. I'd go to put my nose up to the glass, and I'd look down, and if you're on the 25th floor and you see a manhole cover from a sewer, well, that's the dimension. You think I'm going down a tube that wide, 25 stories deep." After weeks of careful melting, the team finally broke through to the buried P-38. What they found astonished them. Despite being crushed by the weight of 264 feet of ice, much of the aircraft was remarkably intact. The aluminum skin still wore its olive drab paint. Inside the cockpit, They found the keys that Harry Smith had tossed there 50 years earlier. They even discovered a canister of Smith's tobacco. The team was elated to have found the long-lost fighter, but now came the biggest challenge of all, getting it out. The 4-foot-wide shaft was far too narrow to extract the entire aircraft in one piece. Instead, the team used a hot water cannon to carve out a 50-foot-wide cavern around the P-38. There, they meticulously disassembled the fighter piece by piece and sent each component to the surface. Extracting the largest section, the 17-foot-long, 3-ton center portion of the aircraft, required sinking 5 separate shafts to create a hole wide enough for its removal. On August 1st, 1992, after months of painstaking work, this final piece reached the surface, completing the most ambitious aircraft recovery in history. As the components were laid out on the ice, the team came up with a fitting name for the rescued P-38. In celebration, they shared a bottle of scotch and christened the aircraft Glacier Girl, a nod to both its icy tomb and its graceful feminine lines. The recovery had been an extraordinary success, but it represented just the first step in the Lightning's resurrection. The components were packed into crates and loaded onto a ship in Denmark. Their destination was a hangar at the small Appalachian town of Middlesboro, Kentucky, where Glacier Girl's long journey back to airworthiness would begin. Restoration. When Glacier Girl's disassembled pieces arrived at Roy Schaffner's hangar in Middlesboro, Bob Carden faced a daunting challenge. The aircraft was now a jigsaw puzzle of components, many damaged by the crushing weight of the glacier. Carden initially estimated the restoration would take 18 months and cost around $600,000. Both projections would prove wildly optimistic. Carden described the difficulties, quote, "Every single piece of the airplane was broken. We got the plane here and found out how little we knew about P-38s. We had no idea what we were doing." Middlesboro, a quiet town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, was hardly a center for aviation restoration expertise. As Schaffner put it, with characteristic bluntness, quote, "There ain't no opera there." The project would rely on a small team of dedicated full-time mechanics, occasionally supplemented by carefully selected volunteers. One such volunteer was Ed White, a U.S. Department of Energy chemist who made the 80-mile round trip from his home in Tennessee more than 600 times to help with the restoration. White meticulously documented the process in 3,000 photographs, creating a valuable record of this unprecedented project. The restoration began with a complete disassembly of all components down to the main wing spar, which remained as the only intact structural element. Working from a set of Lockheed plans obtained from the Smithsonian Institution, Carden stripped every salvageable part to bare metal, treated each with a corrosion inhibitor, then primed and painted it. Parts too damaged for reuse would need to be replaced or recreated. However, with fewer than 25 P-38s remaining in the world in 1992, replacement parts were extraordinarily scarce. The magnesium alloy drums that operated the rudder and ailerons, for instance, were severely corroded, and Carden lacked the drawings needed to reproduce them. It seemed Glacier Girl might never be airworthy again. Finding a solution. Luckily, during a parts hunting trip to California, Carden discovered a collection that included a set of the magnesium alloy drums. He paid $5,000 for a large lot of P-38 parts, a bargain considering the drums alone were worth that price to the project. Similar challenges awaited with nearly every component. 5 of the 6 propeller blades were nearly perfect, but finding a replacement for the damaged 6th seemed impossible until Carden struck an ingenious deal. Having located 4 rare P-38 tires, including 2 with special treads for rough field operations, he traded 2 of these to the Richard I. Bong World War II Heritage Center in Wisconsin in exchange for 1 propeller blade from the static display P-38. The blades were refinished by specialists in San Antonio, Texas. The complex landing gear was shipped to B.F. Goodrich Aerospace in England, which restored it free of charge as a contribution to aviation history. The Allison V-1710 engines were rebuilt by Bill Moja at JRS Enterprises in Minneapolis, who performed the work at cost, another example of how the aviation community rallied around the project. As news of Glacier Girl's restoration spread, the hangar became an impromptu museum. Schaffner kept the facility open to visitors, and by the late 1990s, nearly 50,000 people annually were making the pilgrimage to this small Kentucky town to witness aviation history in the making. Progress was steady, but slow. Carton remembered, quote, "We kept saying 2 more years, 2 more years." A significant milestone came on September 6, 2000, when the team fired up Glacier Girl's engines for the first time since 1942. Finally, by 2002, after nearly a decade of painstaking work and approximately $4 million invested, Glacier Girl was complete. The restoration had incorporated about 80% of the P-38's original parts, an extraordinary achievement considering its long entombment and the damage sustained from the ice pressure. On October 26th of that year, Glacier Girl was ready to fly again. Steve Hinton, president of the Planes of Fame Museum in Chino, California, and an experienced warbird pilot with 300 hours in P-38s, was selected to pilot the restored fighter. With minimal testing, remarkably not even a high-speed taxi run, Hinton took Glacier Girl into the skies above Middlesbrough. An estimated 25,000 people, twice the town's entire population, gathered to witness the historic flight. As the distinctive sound of the twin Allison engines echoed across the valley and the gleaming P-38 soared overhead, the crowd erupted in cheers. Further developments. While Glacier Girl soared again in American skies, her 7 squadron mates remained entombed under ice. The success of the 1992 recovery inspired new generations of explorers to seek out the remaining aircraft. In 2011, a nonprofit organization called Arctic Hot Point Solutions, founded by Southern California businessman Jim Salazar and colleague Ken McBride, began using ground-penetrating radar to search for additional P-38s. Their initial radar sweeps identified a promising target, but the extreme conditions of the Greenland ice cap prevented immediate recovery. The search took a technological leap forward in July 2018, when Salazar's team returned with innovative equipment, a heavy-lift drone equipped with ground-penetrating radar. This aerial approach revolutionized the search process, covering in minutes what would have taken a ground team hours to survey. The drone located what appeared to be another P-38 from the lost squadron, the aircraft piloted by Lieutenant Robert Wilson, nicknamed Echo. To confirm the discovery, the team lowered a steam probe through the ice and were elated when it returned covered in red hydraulic fluid, proof that they had found another aircraft. The team made contact with Brian Wilson, son of the original pilot, to share the news that his father's aircraft had been found. Their ultimate goal is to extract this second P-38 and donate it to a museum, preserving another piece of aviation history.